Hey there everyone. Still haven't made an intro for this series yet, so I'm forced to cut right to the chase once again. Also, the reason this week's episode came out on Tuesday instead of Monday is because I'm writing a pretty big essay Filthy and I have been teasing for a long time, and this episode was initially going to be on a completely different subject, but recent events have made me want to make a short response to a separate position entirely. So for those who are concerned about the weekly routine already being jeopardized due to my notorious inconsistency with uploading over the last few months, don't worry, next week's will be up on time because it's basically already written. So for those who have been frequenting the libertarian commentary communities, particularly on Discord, a new topic of discussion has finally begun to be raised with libertarians, and I say finally because I've been encouraging this and trying to explain that this necessarily has to happen for a very long time. What I'm referring to is what most people, I'd say even a good half of libertarians, refer to as purity spiraling. If you're a sentient being who uses the internet and has ever had a remote interest in discussing anything to the point where you frequent a circle of people who generally talk about a particular subject, regardless of what philosophy is being discussed and what position is being put forward, you've heard of what people call purity spiraling, and there's a generally negative sentiment expressed towards it. For those who don't know, and it wouldn't surprise me if at least one person watching this video didn't, considering that most of the time when it's mentioned, slightly different descriptions of what it is are provided, and it's never really explained why exactly it's an inherently negative thing. But purity spiraling, when most people refer to it broadly, is when a group of people who promote a certain philosophy begin to debate internally about what principles can necessarily define their philosophy's conclusions, what their philosophy's core truth claim is, what the best way to conceptualize certain positions which would lead people to their philosophy's principles carrying the greatest amount of explanatory power would be. Just generally speaking, it's questions being raised by a large amount of people within a given community about what their philosophy actually means. And I really don't see any issues with this. In fact, I would argue that this not only necessarily has to happen for any philosophy to define itself, but this is a good thing for groups who are following a philosophy to do. If a philosophy is proposing a truth claim, that is, its proponents are claiming that it objectively can be used to observe a certain truth in the world or express a certain perspective which defines it as being separate from others, then it has to have an underlying set of principles which explain and make its conclusion necessarily something that can be concluded by anyone, because everyone has a different relative framework through which they view information, which can and would cause them to interpret concepts differently. It's inevitable that how a philosophy's principles are defined, or even the principles which define the philosophy, will eventually come into question due either to a movement growing, a potential oversight being taken into consideration which hadn't previously, someone thinking that they have a way to expand upon the principles as a better way to explain how their conclusion is reached, or some unforeseen and unforeseeable circumstance arises which potentially proves their principles wrong were to come into question. It is an inevitability that there will be internal scrutiny placed upon competing arguments within a philosophical movement. Now, this is something desirable for a few different reasons. For one, if a philosophical movement doesn't do this, then it doesn't have the ability to explain why whatever its position stands for can necessarily be true, nor does its proponents even have the ability to propose a truth claim, because there's nothing stopping anyone with any perspective from proposing their position and claiming that their position is derived from the principles of the philosophy in question. In short, when everyone is a libertarian,
no one will be.
Because libertarianism doesn't mean anything if everyone can call themselves a libertarian regardless of what they're arguing or what their principles are. Another problem that this creates is the emergence of something Konkin referred to in the New Libertarian Manifesto as anti-principles. An anti-principle is when the principles for a philosophy become used vaguely over a long period of time by a large amount of competing different actors, referring to a common principle with increasingly varied descriptions of the core supporting premises or conceptual grounds upon which the principles are explained. This results in either 1. People beginning to make weaker arguments for said philosophy, or inconsistent arguments. 2. People who don't actually understand the philosophy in question, or malicious actors trying to center movements based upon said philosophy around anti-concepts and starting to infiltrate, and the already established members having a difficult time distancing themselves, which in turn destroys the cohesion of their arguments and goals. Or, and most often this is the case, both. Given that so-called purity spiraling is really just the axiomatic equivalent of peer reviewing, why exactly is there such a negative sentiment expressed towards it? Well, most of the time, there is no actual substantive argument provided for why this is undesirable. Probably because most people objecting are either people who have a conscious expressed interest in not having their arguments scrutinized, either because they're malicious or because they're insecure about the strength of their position. The reasons why that might be, I'll leave to your imagination. One thing's for sure though, the people within the libertarian movement who've expressed a negative sentiment towards this internal scrutiny are not being consistent, because, as noted, it's not possible to hold this standard consistently. If you're someone who's in my audience and you think this is wrong, well, if you've ever expressed criticism of a boomer Trump conservative statist or Marxists who identify with libertarian philosophy on the grounds that their arguments have no continuity with libertarian principles, then you're being inconsistent here. But occasionally someone points to a group who started purity spiraling, for lack of a better term, and it led to the group fracturing and people within said group turning against each other, supposedly leaving the group weaker overall than before. Why? Well, that's the problem here. There's no causal explanation provided by people raising this objection explaining why this happens, or what even exactly can be done to prevent it from happening, what they mean by a group getting weaker, and other than this, why it's undesirable. Though, it's absolutely true that there are many philosophy whose practitioners end up splintering into endless subcategories because of this phenomenon. Marxism would be a particularly good example, where there's a different branch of Marxist philosophy professing an entirely different interpretation of the philosophy for literally every prominent Marxist philosopher or politician citing Marxism for the basis of their state's social order while they were head of said state. So why does this happen, and why therefore am I not concerned about this as it pertains to libertarianism? Well, the reason this happens is because the philosophies in question either don't have any cohesive principles which explain why their conclusion is necessary. They either come to a conclusion and then try to work backwards to explain their conclusion, or their principles are based on some inherently arbitrary, flimsy standard used to justify themselves, i.e., Marxists viewing all social organization as being inherently tied to policies created by a central body imposing legislative fiat. As a result, there's no standard which said philosophies could use to say that one set of principles explains their conclusion more than another. In other words, they can't falsify internal disagreements and criticisms. This is why some philosophical movements are more prone to splintering than others, and why some philosophies have more splinter groups than others relative to their scale of people who identify with said groups. These groups are dependent on uniformity in their conception, which is why they splinter the moment their members begin having an internal debate. And they depend on uniformity because their philosophies or particular methodology's foundation is so flimsy. So whether or not internal debate strengthens a philosophy and whether or not a philosophy can survive internal debate should be seen as a litmus test of how well its truth claim stands up to scrutiny in general, and which conception of its principles is most accurate. If a philosophy or a methodology within a philosophy isn't capable of having its principles internally scrutinized, then it isn't worthy of being taken seriously, or at the very least, it needs some work before it can be taken seriously. Which is why libertarian philosophy has generally fared pretty well, and its arguments have actually become stronger because of internal scrutiny. Libertarian philosophy expands to multiple different subjects. In fact, it didn't even start initially as a claim relating to the nature of social organization. It started off as a refutation of determinism based on citing moral agency and the law of non-contradiction. Then, when applied to social organization, its principles started leading people to the conclusion that moral agency created a refutation of the legitimacy of political rule, or a general claim of dominion of some moral agents over others. It has a conclusion which is reached through observations and principles that have a clear explanation for their necessity, as opposed to having its conclusion be presuppositional. It can clearly define the concepts which make up its principles and explain why those concepts make its conclusion stronger or weaker, or take away from its conclusion's explanatory power, i.e. the question of what property is, what an unethical versus ethical action is, or even the nature of an ethical action. Which is why it concerns me to see maybe not a majority, but a decent chunk of people that identify with the libertarian movement so scared of internal debate. It suggests to me that there are a lot of people who don't really understand libertarianism as a philosophy, are being malicious and deliberately promoting subversive concepts designed to undermine the libertarians' ability to articulate their ideas, or simply aren't confident enough in libertarianism's explanatory power, but see it as a means to a desirable end from their relative perspective, which, as expressed earlier and in other videos, is not libertarianism. So why are there so many self-proclaimed libertarians who are averse to having internal debate over the philosophy's principles? Well, that's because there are a lot of people who identify with libertarianism who, quite simply, aren't libertarians. Hence proving my point. It's not too uncommon to run into people who consider political rule to be legitimate and claim to be libertarians, for instance. There are Marxists who consider Marxism to be a libertarian philosophy, despite Marxism being the antithesis of everything libertarianism attempts to prove because of its embrace of materialism, rejection of moral agency, and claim that everything exists to represent a political affiliation. There are people who claim to be libertarians who don't have a truth claim about moral agency or principles in general within their internal reasoning, therefore have no explanation for why political rule can be illegitimate. There are people who claim that liberalism and libertarianism are synonyms, or that libertarianism is a branch of liberalism, and I could go on. And curious how it's always these people who are the ones that are afraid of creating internal debate within the libertarian movement over principles, or how they conceive their position. The partyarchs, or the ones who have ties to state media outlets and organizations like the Cato Institute. The ones who openly encourage libertarians making partnerships with statists. Curious how it's only been a problem since the Libertarian Party came around, and all of these state-connected interest groups started trying to influence the libertarian movement around the party, the same ones who are largely responsible for refusing to go into depth about the principles of libertarianism and keep trying to paint libertarian philosophy as some type of liberalism in order to attract people who aren't libertarians to the libertarian movement. Makes you think, doesn't it? Almost like they have an interest in keeping the libertarian movement ineffective and centered around a conflicting praxis. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe. Tell me what you think in the comments. And I will see you all next time.